Hey there, I'm Portable Orange. You can call me Port. Welcome back. This is part 2 of a deep dive on the ancient Roman religion. As a reminder, this series is primarily about examining the evidence. So, though I'll be presenting scholarly and not so scholarly theories, every piece of evidence I reference will be linked in the companion document, which you can find in the video description. To recap the last video, Rome had started as this pastoral society worshipping either the natural embodiments of or the masters of these sort of natural forces and spaces in the world. As they grew and met their neighbors, they would adopt certain ideas, deities, and rituals from them, with their two biggest influencers being the Etruscans or the Sabines. Our working framework is that Romans were primarily concerned with communication and relationships with these deities. This video is going to cover what I'm going to call the Hellenistic period, where Rome's contact with her Greek neighbors would bring about a huge shift in culture. This would result in new gods, new institutions, and the rise of the mystery cults. Around 400 BC, Rome was growing faster than ever before. They were conquering Etruscan city-states and Latin city-states and basically had a pretty firm grip over most of central Italy. In order to keep growing, they turned to the south of Italy, an area which was at the time known as Magna Graecia, or Big Greece. Technically Great Greece, but Big Greece is funnier. So, in the interest of getting to the religion, we'll skip exactly how this happened, but the very, very short version is Rome basically did nothing and won. Rome probably violated a treaty, and then someone took a shit on someone's toga, and then the Romans just kind of sat around and didn't do anything, and the enemy defeated themselves, and then Rome just settled a bunch of colonies in the new region. Check the companion doc if you want explanations on any of that, but it is what they say happened. This colonization effort finally brought Romans and Greeks into much more direct contact than they'd had prior to this period. Romans were encountering the awe-inspiring architecture, the brilliant art, and the magnificent statues to their gods. And naturally, Romans were quite interested in this culture that seemed at once so familiar and yet so alien. And when I say alien, I mean all that comes with that, minus the UFOs. Interestingly, the Romans were actually kind of mixed on the Greeks when they first met them, something that would carry over into later time periods. The 1st century BC historian Livy would write that the Greeks were nobler in words than in deeds. Romans would trip over themselves trying to import Greek theater, literature, and art, but they were a little more skeptical of the culture that had given rise to these things. To put it a bit more poetically, Romans loved the Greek aesthetic, just not the Greeks. Let's take a look at a few examples to see what I mean. First, let's take a look at one area where Romans just took something that was completely Greek and made it their own: mythology. Around now is when we start seeing an increase in votive deposits depicting scenes from Greek myth. We even have a later book of fables from the fabulist Phaedrus, I know, where the Greek myths are retold with Roman characters. I do want to stress it's not entirely clear how much these myths were believed by the Roman people. We even have later writers like Cicero, a 1st century BC orator and statesman, saying that the gods, by their very nature, sort of probably didn't have relations with each other or children or anything like that. But the fact that he's saying that at all indicates that some people probably did hold that view. So all we know for sure is that the archaeology indicates the myths were getting more popular. Now, you might be wondering, if Greek mythology about the Greek gods was getting so popular, what happened to the Roman mythology about the Roman gods? And the answer is, we don't think they actually had any around this time. A source that illustrates this quite well is Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a 1st century BC Greek historian, who claims that he prefers this Roman mythless form of religion, as in these Greek myths, many of the gods are behaving immorally or erring in some capacity. Cough, cough, Zeus. This might encourage mortals to behave in some of these immoral manners because, hey, that's what the gods are doing. Now, this lack of Roman stories about their gods has given rise to the idea that Rome didn't have any mythology prior to this time period. They were more concerned with farming and war than storytelling. But modern scholarship has really started to push back against this idea. Our old friend George Dumazil has actually been fighting the good fight since the 70s, claiming that, of course, the Romans had myths, and they clearly inherited them from these Proto-Indo-European ancestors. It's just that when the Greeks came along, the Greek myths kind of overwrote the pure Roman ones. He never really addresses why, if Greeks and Romans both came from these Proto-Indo-Europeans, their myths would be different, but I digress. A theory I like much better is put forward by Mary Beard, a modern, very influential historian, who claims that our concept of what a myth is might be a little too narrow, and that Romans almost certainly did have myths, they just didn't feature their gods so heavily. Instead, their myths focused on their ancestors. We know that prior to this time period, many Italian cultures had their own myths about their founding. Yet despite how old these myths are, it's not really until the 3rd century BC we start seeing them take a much more central place in Rome's culture. We start seeing coins minted, statues made, and even inscriptions on the tombs of Romans referencing their ancestry. Now, you can argue that these inscriptions might not be mythological in a sense, but it shows the increased importance the Romans were placing on their past. Now, to be fair, Greeks also had myths about their own history. Even ignoring the Iliad and the Odyssey, they had myths that early kings had been carved out of the earth, or Jason and the Argonauts, or Theseus and his famous ship. And in the same way that Greek myths attempted to explain why the world was the way the world was, Roman myths attempted to explain why cultural institutions were the way they were. Why do we have a calendar that's so important? Well, because the second king of Rome, Numa Pompilius, gave it to us. Why do we dedicate our war spoils to Jupiter instead of Mars? Well, because that's what Romulus did. Why do we have a senate when everyone else has a king? Well, because Romulus established the Senate, and then the later Tarquins got a little too handsy. And in the same way, Dionysius of Halicarnassus states that Greeks don't truly believe everything about their own mythology, it seems like the Romans didn't necessarily believe everything about their own history. It's really funny if you ever read some of the histories like Livy's from the founding of the city, where he'll say things like, well, everyone says this, but I don't know if I believe it, or I don't know if this makes sense, but this is how the story goes, or my favorite, well, look, I've heard two different conflicting viewpoints. I'm just going to give you both, but I have no idea which one's true. It kind of shows this dual skepticism that was in place, mirroring both Greek myths and Roman histories, giving credence to Beard's theory that these Roman myths did exist. They were just about their histories. And there are plenty of other things in this category, statues and oracles being obvious ones, but I don't want this to be a 3-hour video just on that, so check the companion doc if you want to read more. But again, I want to stress many of these outright adoptions were still just sort of aesthetic in nature. In no way did it ever really fundamentally change the underlying theology. So now let's look at some areas where this influence on Roman religion got a little tricky. If you know much about Greek mythology, you probably have heard of the 12 Olympians, or the group of 12 gods which were considered to be the most important to the ancient Greeks. The Romans thought that structure was pretty cool, and so they adopted it for themselves, forming the deconsentes, or the consenting or harmonious gods. This was basically just composed of the Roman version of the Greek 12 Olympians, which, if I can do from memory, was Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, Mars, Mercury, Venus, Vulcan, Vesta, Ceres, Diana, Apollo, Neptune. Now, firstly, we're not actually sure how much this grouping actually mattered from like a theological perspective. We first see this group referenced around the end of the 3rd century BC, and we know that they had a statue in the Roman Forum. So they served at the very least as, I'm sort of loath to say mascots, but basically mascots of the Roman religion. But of those 12, only 4 had flamens, those kind of special priests which were above the other ones. The rest just had appointed priests, which had much more relaxed rules than what the flamens had to follow. Check the companion doc if you care more about that. You might also notice that the 12 Olympians don't quite line up with the deconsentes. Many versions of the Greek 12 Olympians have Dionysus instead of Vesta. Just to clarify, within Greece, occasionally the 12 Olympians did include Hestia over Dionysus, but plenty of times she was excluded as well, such as here, the image from the Parthenon at Athens. In fact, one of the oldest written records of the 12 Olympians we have includes Dionysus and excludes Hestia. In the end, the version with Dionysus would become the far more popular one in the Greek mainland. And this is because Bacchus, the god of wine, wasn't really seen in the same way the Greeks saw Dionysus. While both cultures acknowledged Bacchus was related to wine, the Greeks had much more of an emphasis on the festival aspect of him, the theater and the revelry, whereas Romans put a lot more emphasis on the madness that wine could bring about, lightweights. And if you look hard enough, you can actually find many of these differences between the two groups. Mars is one of the clearest examples. In Rome, he was not just associated with war, he was also associated with agriculture. He was the stereotypical Roman farmer soldier and embodied so much of the values of what it meant to be Roman. As a result, he was a lot more stoic and reserved than his hot-headed Greek counterpart. Which brings me to the first misconception I want to clear up. Though the Romans saw many similarities between the deities they were worshipping and the ones the Greeks were worshipping, the Romans didn't copy the Greek gods. Recall that the Romans did not claim they had complete or perfect knowledge of their own gods. No matter what form the gods took, they knew the relationship, the communication they'd established with those gods was the important thing that they valued. To this end, when they saw a group of people worshipping a sky deity that controlled the rain and was associated with thunderbolts, they just kind of went, oh, funny. So that's how you guys see Jupiter. This is why Marcus Aurelius, a later Roman emperor, in his famous Meditations, would refer to Jupiter as Zeus, because he was writing in Greek. And in Greek, the word for Jupiter was Zeus. To put it a little more clearly, it wasn't even that the word for Jupiter was Zeus. It was just the word for the guy that was in the sky who controlled the rains. In Latin was Jupiter, and in Greek was Zeus. Similarly, when Julius Caesar was in Gaul, he wrote back home to the Romans that the Gauls worshipped Mercury above all others, likely referring to Lugus, although there are other Gallic deities it may have been. But he didn't stop there. He claimed they also worshipped Apollo, Mars, Jupiter, and Minerva, even claiming that their beliefs about these deities was similar to the beliefs of the other nations. To be very clear, from what we know, the Gauls did not worship these Roman deities. They just happened to have a war god and a rain god and a god of travel and so on and so forth. But when Caesar saw these gods and their depictions, he naturally assumed that they were the same gods the Romans were worshiping. Because to him, the Romans didn't worship their gods, they just worshipped the gods. These gods were just the natural forces that existed in the world. So when you go to a foreign nation and find them worshiping one of these natural forces, you just naturally assume that the thing they're worshiping is the same thing you're worshiping. Just these people use a different name and a different image, which is probably less pleasing to that god than the ones the Romans used.
And much like with the Etruscans, when Romans saw these amazing Greek cities and temples, they naturally wanted to try out some of these things to see if maybe they could supplement their own relationship with the gods. Though many of the gods would end up being similar in terms of myth and depiction, the rituals, the worship, and even the domains of some of these gods would never quite line up. The Roman gods never stopped being Roman. They just started wearing Greek clothes.
Now, before we move off this, there is one interesting side note I found in my research that I just want to bring up, which is that the misconceptions that the Roman gods were originally Greek seems to actually predate our modern era. As we went over last video, Ceres, the goddess of wheat, is unquestionably an Italic deity, maybe even a Latin one. We have this inscription going back to at least 600 BC, where she is asked to provide far, or spelt wheat. But Cicero, a senator and augur himself, would claim that Ceres' rites were originally Greek, and that the Romans had even imported Greek priests to teach them how to do the rituals properly, although from Magna Graecia, not the Greek mainland. Again, just an interesting little side note. And Cicero is referring to the rites, not like the concept of Ceres herself as a person. But it is interesting to see this misconception that Romans got all their stuff from the Greeks is frankly older than the Roman Empire. So we've looked at some things that were adopted, as well as some things that weren't adopted quite as cleanly. But everything we've examined up until now has been mostly the state religion, the public civic religion. But if you recall from the last video, Rome also had a very rich, robust tradition of private home worship. But the Greeks didn't. They didn't have any Greek equivalents to the Lars or the Genius or even the Penates. And so, as a result, a lot of Roman home religion went through this period largely unchanged. This is to say nothing of the Roman deities, which didn't have a Greek counterpart, the obvious ones being Janus, Quirinus, and, of course, Portinus. That last one never even really getting a depiction in the Greek statue fashion. But that's not to say private religion didn't change at all. On the contrary, some of the changes that were introduced were so dramatic it'd lead to several crises down the line. Because around the 3rd century is when we start seeing the rise of the mystery cults. Ooh, spooky mystery cult. In modern English, the words mystery cult evoke the idea of a secret society. And that's sort of close, but not really. A mystery cult, in some ways, was indistinguishable from the worship of any Lar or Genius. They were religious organizations which usually were open to the public in some capacity, but would restrict their membership, and would forbade any members from speaking of their rituals outside of the cult. For a modern example, think of Scientology, a religion where anyone can basically walk in and get a Thetan reading, but if you want to know some of the higher secrets of the organization, you have to be a member for a while and achieve a certain rank. Or watch that one episode of South Park. And these cults were almost always to, and if you're just listening, I'm using air quotes here, foreign deities. The first was potentially to the god Aesculapius, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. This was a god imported when Rome was facing a plague, and when seeking out the oracle at Delphi was told that they should seek out Apollo's son, Aesculapius, which would eventually be seen fairly positively. He would just become sort of the patron deity of doctors. But the history of mystery cults, that's fun, but the history of mystery cults actually far predates Aesculapius. In fact, in Greece, the oldest one we know of was already 1,000 years old in the 3rd century BC. The Eleusinian. This is how you know I'm not a historian, is I will just do this without once looking up the pronunciation that I get here, and I'm like, 3 hours into recording, and I'm like, oh, maybe I should learn how to pronounce this word that I've only ever read. Anyway. In Greece, the oldest of these cults, the Eleusinian Mysteries, was already over 1,000 years old, 1300 BC, although possibly quite a bit younger. The later poet Varro, writing a history of Roman religion in the 1st century BC, would tie Rome's religious origins with the cult on the Isle of Samothrake, the sanctuary to the great gods. Now, this sanctuary prominently featured a great mother, possibly a corollary to the one that would really kick off the mystery cults in Rome, the cult to Cybele. Also for the pedants, yes, it probably should be Cybele with a hard C, but in common parlance, it's often said as Cybele, the same way that we say Caesar, not Kaiser. So if you disagree with that, feel free to suck my sock. Cybele was first imported into Rome because Rome was struggling in a war they were fighting. As they were basically on the verge of losing, they consulted the Sibylline books, or this famous books that contain many prophecies, to see how they might be able to turn things around. The books let them know that part of why Rome was struggling was they had fallen out of favor with the Great Mother, which, depending on which historian you trust, was either located here, here, or here. Ovid, a poet writing in the 1st century BC, claims that she was the mother of all Roman gods, which, under our current understanding of Roman religion, would make sense why they were struggling in this war. The mother of their chief god, indeed all their gods, had been abandoned when they had left Troy, and naturally wasn't giving them her favor as a result. By bringing her back and apologizing and trying to reestablish a successful relationship with her, they might be able to turn things around and regain her favor. Her cult, however, was a little bit different from Roman cults. Now, the Romans wanted her to be comfortable, so they invited her priests from her home temple to Rome to teach them the proper ways to worship. They wanted to make sure she felt respected and welcomed. And the priests told them that one of the things she really liked was her male priests cutting their junk off. Yeah. This would be the start of an uneasy relationship between Rome and the mystery cults. Our old friend Dionysius of Halicarnassus tells us that in the 1st century BC, Roman citizens were forbidden by law from either joining her cult or even participating in some of her rituals. Weirdness aside, she was still the mother of all Roman deities, though. And maybe if Aeneas had taken her with him when he fled Troy, Romans wouldn't see some of these things as that weird. But the fact remained that they did. And so a compromise of sorts was struck. She would receive her priests and festivals just the way she liked it, and the Romans would tack on to that the games and festivals just the way they liked it. And they kind of hoped that this fusion would be pleasing to her, which evidently it was. But this uneasy truce, this trying to have it both ways, would lead to a tension that frankly would never really get resolved. Centuries later, Cicero would note that though her festival and rituals had clearly begun from a pious place, the extravagance and opulence of the games these days had moved it far outside the realm of what should be acceptable to any self-respecting Roman. Now, I do want to remind you that most of the writings we have from around this time period only come from the elite, and we can't be sure that the lower classes would have agreed with Cicero's statement here, or even that most of the upper classes would. And frankly, every populist from Caesar to Constantine would throw these fairly lavish, opulent games, and that did seem to win over the common people in general. Bread and circuses. Now, the reason I caveat like that is, regardless of what people may have thought, these mystery cults exploded in popularity during the 2nd century BC, and some of them would last right up until the Christianization of the empire. One of the other big ones was the cult to Isis. Yes, that Isis. I actually got to go to one of her temples, which was in Mainz, and it was really cool, actually, to see, actual real votive pits just in the floor beneath you as you're walking around. It was a really neat experience. Anyway, but Isis's introduction to Roman religious life didn't seem to go that smoothly. In fact, we have evidence her temples were completely destroyed several times in the 1st century BC. And this shows that these mystery cults were, at least in some capacity, worrying to these elites. My guess would, again, be that it probably has to do with the secrecy. Because, again, what if these people are doing things which might end up offending the gods, and then they withdraw their favor from the Roman people? Or, worse yet, what if these mystery cults are messing with the fabric of Roman society itself? A good but likely apocryphal example of this would be Livy's story of the cult to Bacchus from the mid-Republic. Livy claims the cult is producing these lazy, pleasure-obsessed men that would just make terrible soldiers. But on top of that, the cult is functioning like a secret society. They're committing frauds, they're committing murders, they're committing basically every crime imaginable. And at the rate at which the cult is growing, they're soon going to have enough power to overtake the Roman state itself. At the end of the story, the Senate simply seizes control of the cult, but notably, they don't destroy it. They just restrict how many members can gather at one given time. From what we know, the cult remained wildly popular, with inscriptions as far north as Germany. In fact, one of the only examples of Roman painting that we have is from the Villa of Mysteries, from Pompeii, the 1st century AD. It depicts many rites which we know from other writers to be associated with the cult of Bacchus, and it's pretty big. It basically wraps around the entire room. Whoever had it didn't really seem to be ashamed of their association with the cult. So time to see if you've been paying attention. Or to see if I've explained things well enough yet. Why didn't the Senate just destroy this cult? Well, because Bacchus still existed. Even though this deity might have sort of a sinister nature, might not necessarily be something you want to bring home to dinner, Rome still needed a relationship with this deity. And we'd see this with many deities which might have a negative connotation with them. Febra being one of the most famous. Why would Romans pray to fever? Well, to make it go away. And this is why the mystery cults were not just permitted, but quite widespread. In fact, they weren't seen as opposed to the Roman religion at all. If the state religion was about establishing relationships with these gods and the Roman people, making sure that the gods most important to the success of the state had a good relationship with the state, it's not weird that you as an individual would form relationships with gods that were more important to you as an individual, say a winemaker with Bacchus, or even you in your own household lore. And with that, we're right around the year 200 BC, meaning we can finally talk about one of the oldest documents that directly talks about Roman private religion, Cato the Elder's On Agriculture. This is the oldest non-fragmented and original Roman piece of writing we have that really talks about private worship, and it shows just how ingrained in everyday life religion was. Although, I do want to caveat before we get into it, Cato the Elder was a patrician, so he was a very wealthy individual, and we don't know that the lower classes would have necessarily had the same experience. By the way, the whole document is actually really interesting. If you want to see what it was like to run a farm in the 2nd century BC in the Italian countryside, it really is worth a read, but we're just going to focus on the religious aspects, obviously. Now, much of these rituals we already know, such as Cato saying the first thing you do when you get home should be to greet your household lore. So I want to focus a lot more on the rituals he talks about were involved in farming. One of the clearest examples of a ritual that Roman farmers might have engaged in comes in the middle of a bunch of recipes, where Cato explains to us the proper ritual to pray for the health of your cattle. The prayer is addressed to Mars Silvanus, again using other gods' names as an epithet. Silvanus, by the way, was the god of the woods, but like the wild woods, like the untamed stuff that you'd then clear to make pastures for. And also animals. As with most Roman rituals, it's outside during the day, and most of the eating of the sacrifices is done by you and whoever else you bring with you. Just to be clear, though, it's very expensive. You're expected to offer 3 pounds of grain meal, 4.5 pounds of bacon, 4.5 pounds of animal flesh, and 3 pints of wine per cow. If you have 20 cows on your farm, that's well over a year's pay for a soldier. Also, make sure no women see or take part in this ritual, because Mars Silvanus is just interested in men, right, boys? Right, boys? It's men's stuff. Women wouldn't get it. Women wouldn't get it. Interestingly, Cato ends this section by saying you can do this every year if you wish, implying you don't have to do this every year. Cato later mentions you should do this as the pear trees bloom, and this is also around when you should start sowing your seeds. Again, interestingly, he says you should make an offering to Jupiter and also to Vesta if you wish. And it's just interesting, a lot of this ambiguity exists even in kind of the private home worship, when from what we know, the state public worship was incredibly scripted. Jupiter's offering is wine and meat, and this time he actually does give us the formula, which goes as follows. Jupiter de Pallas, for as much as it is fitting that a cup of wine be offered thee in my house and in the midst of my people for the sacred feast, and to that end, be thou honored by the offering of this food. Then wash your hands, take the wine, and say, Jupiter de Pallas, be thou honored by the offering of thy feast, and be thou honored by the wine placed before thee. There's a similar sacrifice to be made before the harvest, although it is much more involved and involves a ton of deities.
First, you offer wine and incense to Janus, Jupiter, and Juno. Then you offer cakes to Janus with a prayer. Then Jupiter also gets a cake. Then Janus and Jupiter get wine in the same order. Then Ceres gets her pig. Then Janus and Jupiter get more cakes and more wine, and then Ceres gets the entrails of the pig and also wine.
All that just to harvest your grain. The rest of this document is mostly going through the incredibly hard work you're going to have to do in order to keep your farm working. And to me, that really beautifully illustrates kind of what we've been examining this whole time. In the 2nd century BC, it's not just you growing your crops, it's the gods too. They deserve their respect, they deserve their place. But at the end of the day, it's all of you guys working together side by side. And so at the end of the day, you all sit down to a feast. They're a lot more important than you, so they get the cuts they want and they get to eat first and all that fun stuff. But it's kind of a team effort between you and the gods to make things work. This was a world where divine beings had enormous control over so many things, but at the end of the day, they didn't control everything, and thus the need for the relationship. Because Ceres could make the wheat grow, but she couldn't plant it in the ground herself. And that specifically, I think, because I'm sort of dipping into theory here more now, I think that's why the mystery cults grew so much in popularity. If you imagine a world where religion's really about the relationship, and these gods and you are working side by side, hand in hand, day in and day out, visiting a temple might feel kind of lonely. You know, you're going to go to this big building, you know, with this very austere sort of exterior, and you're going to talk to basically the god's secretary and say, hey, can you pass this message along? And they'll say, well, I'll pass it along, but I don't know if the god's going to do anything. And then you just go home and wait to see if they heard you. The whole thing likely felt incredibly indirect and not really personal at all. But with the mystery cults, all that changed. While some of these gods, like Isis notably, promised, you know, eternal life and service of her in the afterlife and all these various things, at the end of the day, I would imagine that it was the community these mystery cults formed. The fact that you could go, meet the same people, have this feeling of like, I know a secret that everyone else out there doesn't know. That, I imagine, would be a much more powerful thing for people than, again, this kind of faceless, ritualistic kind of state religion. In fact, one of the very few writings we have which directly references this cult is the book Metamorphosis, in which a man is turned into a giant a man is turned into a regular-sized donkey, and Isis herself actually appears to help the man out of his predicament. Talk about a personal touch.
The book actually is pretty funny. I feel like in all my deep dives, I just keep finding out the Romans actually had a pretty good sense of humor. My favorite line here is where he laments that though he can no longer touch his love, his dong did get bigger. So, you know, not all bad.
This lines up with another account from the Roman writer Pausanias, who claims that you weren't allowed to join the cult of Isis unless she personally invited you to. In a dream. She didn't like descend from the heavens or anything like that. But again, it's a very personal touch. And I think this is why we're about to see what we're about to see. A massive decline in votive offerings from this period. I think it was the introduction of these mystery cults caused a real shift in importance for your average Roman. If you needed help with love, for example, why go to Venus? You've never met this person. She's just some random faceless thing. Isis appeared to you personally and asked you to join her cult. Why not just go to her for it? Now, again, I want to caution, we don't know why we saw this decline in votive offerings. All we know is that it happened. But in my opinion, there are a few things that kind of waggle their eyebrows furtively and mouth, look over there. One of the biggest pieces of evidence being a growing, let's call it skepticism of the picture of the divine that the Roman state painted. For this, I want to turn to Cicero again. Keep in mind, Cicero himself was an augur, a member of a priestly college that would determine the auspices by reading the behavior of birds. In On Divination, Cicero opens by talking about how pretty much everyone knows that the gods can communicate the future directly to people if they so wish. He backs this up by referencing several famous instances from Roman history, already mythologized even in his time. But he then goes on to say that anyone whose job it is to tell you the future is lying to you. Cicero claims everyone knows this, even referencing a story from Cato, where he remarks, it's a wonder that a soothsayer doesn't burst out into laughter upon seeing another soothsayer. Even the practice of augury, again, his own school, he claims is so vague and so easy to interpret however you want that it's practically useless. Rome's sacred chickens were often consulted to see if certain actions should be done, where if they eat greedily, that was considered, a yes, and if they didn't eat at all, that was considered to be a no. But Cicero points out most of the people in charge of these chickens would just starve them if they wanted them to eat greedily, or overfeed them if they didn't want them to eat at all, thereby basically controlling the results to be whatever they wanted. On the nature of the gods, Cicero goes even more into detail on this exact question.
By the negligence of our nobility, the discipline of the augury is now omitted, and only a mere form observed, so that the most important affairs of the commonwealth, Even the wars are conducted without any auspices. Just to be clear, Cicero's position isn't that the gods and auspices aren't real at all, just that over time, people misconstrued and overcomplicated things.
I want to look at one passage near the end where Cicero states, Zeno first, and after him Cleanthes and Chrysippus, are put to the unnecessary trouble of explaining mere fables and giving reasons for the several appellations of every deity, which is really owing that those whom we call gods are not the representation of deities, but natural things, and that to judge otherwise is an error. I'll note the philosophers mentioned here are Stoic, a school which would become very popular in Rome in just a little while, although it was already pretty popular even in this time. Now, Cicero goes on to argue against this position, claiming that too many things are seen as divine these days. The temple to fever or ill fortune, any of these things he views as, kind of not worthwhile. But the fact that he argues against it and the existence of those deities as such indicates again a growing sort of resistance to the standard Roman state religion, which gets to the heart of another of the biggest misconceptions I see people have about the Roman religion. The idea that the Roman religion did not require belief. Now, this is sort of true in the sense that the gods didn't require belief in the concept of you need to accept Jupiter into your heart. Because when it rained, that just was Jupiter. If you could go back in time and walk up to an ancient Roman and say, hey, just so you know, I don't believe in soul, actually, they'd look really confused at you and then look up and go, then what is that thing in the sky? Now, if you recall from my hedging last video and earlier in this one, this wasn't a universal opinion. There were people who saw the gods simply as masters of their domains, not the actual embodiment of the natural forces themselves. But Cicero wasn't the only person to argue against this position. Lucretius Carus actually lays this out in a poem we found called On the Nature of Things, where he scornfully imagines a typical Roman calling the ocean Neptune, or the grain crop Ceres, or abuses the name of Bacchus by preferring to use his name rather than that of the drink in front of him. Lucretius, also Lucretius, some people do say Lucretius, it's up to you, whatever you want to do, then goes on to lay out a certain view of the world called Epicureanism. As I mentioned earlier, the contact between Rome and Greece had led to the spread of many Greek philosophical schools, and some of these schools directly contradicted the standard Roman view of the divine. Epicureanism in its time was the biggest of these. They believed that the gods had created the world, but then just simply left, and that the world was just so well ordered that things continued on without the need for any intervention of oversight. The poem lays this out quite clearly, stating very early on, for all gods must of themselves enjoy immortal aeons and supreme repose, withdrawn from our affairs, detached afar. It's really fascinating reading this poem. I highly recommend it, because it's funny when you get to things like, earthquakes aren't Neptune, you dumbass, it's the earth trembling, which, that part's right, but what he believes it comes from is mountains just randomly collapsing into the earth and us just feeling the shock waves. But he also does know about atoms. He talks about everything must be made of this smallest unit, or maybe he knows about Plancks or something. I don't know. Either way, it's really interesting to read how much of this he gets almost right, and this is the 1st century. Julius Caesar's father-in-law and wife were Epicurists from what we know, and Caesar may have been himself, although there's sort of evidence both ways for that. Plenty of prominent senators around his time were as well. It was a growing movement, growing in popularity, meaning this sort of disillusionment with at least the Roman state religion was probably getting more popular with the elites. And if you combine that with mystery cults getting more popular with the lower classes, we have a pretty neat explanation for why votive deposits declined so much during this period. Though again, this is just my theory. There are other theories out there, and I'll link them in the companion doc if you care to peruse them. Again, I really want to stress this was not due to everyone becoming enlightened atheists. Their professional quote makers were nowhere near modern levels. But it likely was due to a combination of factors. This being one, the rise of the mystery cults being another, and probably also the economic hardships that the late Republic was experiencing, something which had basically been off and on since the brothers Gracchi. But before we get to Caesar and the empire, I want to talk about magic, because I honestly couldn't really find a great place to put this otherwise. So if you watched this far, congratulations. You now get to see a sacred schlong. Going back to Cato the Elder, he does list a few remedies that we might see as magical, such as grinding up a snake skin to give to your oxen, or if they have a cold, both you and the ox need to be standing and fasting when you give them their medicine. That might not be specifically magic. It's completely unrelated to this video, but one of the big things that always bugs me is the idea that in medieval times, they would chant spells, because you'd say 10 Hail Marys when you were boiling something. Probably that was just a way of keeping time. But it's easy to look at that and say, oh, you need to say 10 Hail Marys, it's magic. In a similar way, is the ox just fasting to make sure that they eat the medicine? It is a little weird that you're fasting, though, if that's the case. Compare this with Cato's remedy for a fracture, which I'm just going to read because I can't keep it straight. You're supposed to split a reed, hold the halves on either side of the fracture, and chant, Motas ueta daries dardares astatares disunapiter. Then hold the knife over both halves of the reed and chant the following: Huat, haut, istasis, tarsis, ardanabo, danausta. Just for the record, that's not Latin. Now this feels like magic. I really don't know what else you call it. You're literally chanting a spell. But it's presented alongside other remedies that aren't magic at all, such as using wormwood to prevent chafing. And wormwood is still used to this day as an anti-inflammatory. And this actually is a rather good view of how Romans saw magic and magecraft. It was just another tool for you to use, just like anything else in the natural world. In fact, in the Republic and early Empire, soothsayers would often set up just right outside temples to sell their amulets and charms and read your fortune, which is, again, why several emperors actually expelled them, because they were seen as, kind of disruptive to the respect that we should be paying the gods. There was power in the world. There were forces in the world. And if you knew the right things to say and the right actions to take, you could take advantage of these forces. And yes, for all you smartasses typing out a comment about Newman right now, that's next episode, okay? And I'll explain why we haven't covered it up until now. And an important note here, Romans were very concerned with people using magic against each other. In fact, the oldest Roman legal document we know of, the 12 Tables, supposedly written in 450 BC, actually includes several laws punishing people who use magic improperly. This includes using magic to steal someone else's crops, and possibly also cursing someone in public, but the Latin there is a little confusing. It might have just been like defaming someone in public. The most common form of magical objects which have survived to us are curse tablets, which, in keeping with the theme of this video, are likely imports from Greece. These were lead tablets inscribed with some sort of set of instructions, usually trying to bind a deity to do something that would then be buried, sometimes often with a little doll and a little nail through the doll. Now, these tablets covered everything from asking someone to fall in love with you, to asking the gods to kill them and their new lover, to asking them to heal your heartbreak once you've processed and moved on from everything. These aren't all from the same person, but it would be funny if it was. My favorite form of amulet was, how do I get away with this on YouTube? The Fascinus, which was, a big old schlong. Now, this hunk of meat was actually incredibly sacred to the Romans. Pretty much every Roman boy would grow up with a pouch filled with amulets tied around their neck, this being one of the most common ones. And plenty of Roman senators and older adults would wear a gold ring with this stamped into the signet. In fact, even the Vestal Virgins would actually guard a sacred version of the Fascinus in the Temple of Vesta. So, yeah, he got around. The phallus was seen as inherently protective, especially against the evil eye or a look which could, just give you bad luck. This leads to my favorite picture, which I'm probably going to have to censor too much for you to even understand what's going on, of Fascinus himself dropping a big old load on the evil eye, which causes it to close. His entire torso and head are a giant phallus, but no, that is not where he is nutting from. No, that'd be ridiculous. He obviously nuts from his smaller phallus. That's where any normal person would have one, because that makes way more sense. There were other amulets too, of course, clasped hands, the chimaruta, wheat, a bunch of different ones, and there doesn't really seem to be any sort of clear organization to them, which, again, indicates this was probably all outside the Roman state religion. This area of Roman belief just isn't that well documented. We have almost no writings talking about this, hence why I left it for the end. And why I didn't bring it up in the last video, because in the Archaic period, it's almost impossible to separate stuff like this from just normal votive offerings. But I will link a bunch of stuff in the companion document if you do want to look more into it. It is sad how little private religion kind of gets addressed like this. However, from what we know, private religion, like the Lares and Genius, basically continued without too many changes during this period. But with the mystery cults growing and the elites, at the very least, getting a little disillusioned with religion, we're starting to see a really big shift in how the Romans interface with the divine. So with philosophy giving people morals and mystery cults giving people community and that personal touch, the civic religion was really just a bunch of fun festivals and the obligatory sacrifices. And even then, only if you needed it. The Roman people were clearly moving away from any kind of centralized state religion into a bunch of smaller groups of private religions, which naturally meant the elite were sort of losing their control a little bit. And then one day, a man decided to cross a river. A man who would change the fate of Rome forevermore. The first man since Romulus, who was to be honored with a place among the gods. Julius Caesar. And we'll cover him next time. Take care. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. If you want to see the third video, subscribe. If you didn't enjoy it, remember to hit that dislike button. And if you don't want to subscribe, don't.